Welcome. I'm Trent Thompson with Thomas & Hutton. The purpose of this presentation is to provide information on the proposed water supply for North Bryan County and the I-16 Megasite, which is now home to the Hyundai Motor Group Metaplant America, or simply HMGMA. Topics that will be covered in this presentation include a brief history of the Savannah Harbor Interstate 16 Joint Development Authority, or JDA, as well as a background on the Florida Aquifer System, information on the proposed water infrastructure, and the proposed draft groundwater use permits. The JDA, which was formed in 2014, was set up to establish a regional approach for identifying and promoting a megasite for an OEM facility. In May of 2022, Hyundai selected the Bryan County site for its new EV production facility. In addition to approximately $27 million in due diligence cost, there's also been a significant amount of water and sewer infrastructure planning that has gone in to serve this site and transformative growth that's planned in the region. Of course, to accomplish an infrastructure endeavor of this type, it's going to take some time and it's going to cost a fair amount of money. So there's been a phased approach to this from the start. We'll get into that a little bit. Now for some background on the Florida Aquifer System. The Florida Aquifer System is one of the largest and most productive aquifers in the world. It covers about 100,000 square miles across all of Florida, the southern half of Georgia, and parts of Alabama and South Carolina. What you'll see in these two exhibits are representations graphically of the different geology that underlies this aquifer. And of course, each one of these regions act and function slightly differently. We'll get into that briefly later in the presentation, but the thing to focus in on here is the dark brown on the left image, which represents areas of thickly confined portions of the aquifer. Next is the groundwater management zones in coastal Georgia. There's a lot of misunderstanding and misconception out in the public as to what these color codes really mean. The misunderstanding is that these represent saltwater intrusion, which has been a frequent topic in coastal Georgia since the early 2000s. The thought is that red represents areas of heavy saltwater intrusion, yellow of partial saltwater intrusion, and green no saltwater intrusion. That's not the case. In fact, what these color codes really represent is Georgia EPD's management plan for groundwater use permits. Red meaning restrictions and reductions to pumping rates back to what was then the 2024 limits, the 2004 withdrawal limits. Yellow meaning slight increases through 2008 and now no additional pumping. And then the green was no restrictions and further study needed. In fact, the only areas that actually have experienced saltwater intrusion are the T-Plume near Brunswick, a very specific area, and an area known as the Beaufort Arch near Hilton Head, where that thick confining layer actually thins and gets close to the surface. So again, just to make sure everybody is clear, the red and yellow do not represent areas that have experienced saltwater intrusion. These are just merely color codes EPD uses to help it in its management plan for further groundwater withdrawal permits. Now, for the 10 years of due diligence planning that went into the megasite itself, the plan then is as what it is now, which is that it was going to be a phased approach and would require initially groundwater supply to meet the immediate needs of the facility and the surrounding area, and then long-term bringing surface water from Savannah River in to ultimately serve the site and other industries that would be brought to the area. That plan is unchanged and is still the case now. For the water infrastructure, the concept that we've gone with and which is now partially complete is a regional force main that would extend from the Interstate 16 megasite down to the existing City of Savannah system near John Carter Road and Old River Road. This would allow the initial construction and initial flows of wastewater coming from the megasite to be treated by the City of Savannah. And then ultimately, due to a partnership between Bryan County and the City of Savannah, this force main could be redirected and let flows go the opposite direction, where western Chatham County actually parts of southern Effingham County, could turn around and send wastewater to the new regional facility being constructed to serve North Bryan County. In addition, Bullock County can also share in that use of regional infrastructure and send its wastewater from Southeast Bullock to that same regional Bryan County facility. The proposed facility in North Bryan County is a membrane bioreactor, or MBR type treatment plant, that produces a very high quality effluent that can be used for all sorts of reclaimed water needs, such as irrigation, processed water, cooling tower water, etc. So it's really a great regional benefit, and a really great regional use at how to best use wastewater for other intended purposes. Next, I want to cover briefly the near-term water withdrawal and water transmission system. This was the original concept that was put together by Bryan County and Bullock County to serve the area. And you'll notice it includes wells a little closer to the Ogeechee River to the east. Through coordination with EPD and their planning and their modeling of aquifers, in particular existing agricultural and private residential wells in the area, it was ultimately determined that a better solution would be to move the wells to the north and west. It would have less of an impact on those existing private and agricultural wells. So the system was revised, and Bullock and Bryan proposed this revised layout and concept, which still includes 4 wells, but now those wells extend to the west along Highway 46 and 119. And again, this was reviewed by EPD to look at what those impacts were to the region. And this provided a much reduced impact to those existing wells, and also promotes further expansion to the north and west if future groundwater was to be considered. The draft permits that are before EPD right now for consideration are actually 2 separate permits. Bryan County has a permit in review right now for 3.5 million gallons per day from 2 wells, the 2 easternmost wells, and Bullock County has a permit request in for 3.125 million gallons per day from the western 2 wells. As part of the draft permit that EPD is considering, it includes both short-term and long-term mitigation measures. We'll get into the short-term well mitigation measures shortly. But for the long term, there is a requirement for an alternative water supply to be completed within 25 years. The most likely source of that alternative water supply is surface water from the Savannah River. One of the things that is important to understand is why the 25 years? Why so much time? And the answer for that is pretty straightforward and simple. Due to the size and complexity of the infrastructure required to get that volume of water out to the west, it's going to take some time. It includes about 25 to 30 miles of large diameter water main that would have to be extended across 3 counties, as well as major upgrades to existing water treatment facilities and raw water intakes into the Savannah River. So something like that is going to take a considerable amount of time, both in planning of the route, potential easements and property acquisition, funding, and honestly, how that funding can be paid back over time. So it's going to take some time, and the estimate right now is about 25 years to accomplish all the environmental permitting, planning, and engineering involved. Now, a brief, not too overly technical summary of aquifers in the area, and the general understanding that not all aquifers are the same. There's a lot of public discourse out there that the proposed pumping from the Floridan aquifer is somehow going to affect surface levels of ponds, nearby streams, rivers, wetlands, that sort of thing. And that's simply just not the case. In this part of the coast of Georgia, there's really 2 main types of aquifers at this level. The uppermost or superficial aquifer is also called the water table, basically. It is an unconfined aquifer. It sits above the confining layer we talked about earlier, and it does have a direct connection and direct impact to surface waters. Below that, though, is about a 300-foot thick confining layer or aquitard of dense clay that prevents and minimizes any transition of water vertically through that layer. Below that is the confined Floridan aquifer. It's also sometimes referred to as an artesian aquifer. And really what that means is you've got a thick layer of limestone that goes down several more hundred feet and is under pressure. So much so that when you drill a well down into that aquifer, the water actually rises up into that well. Think about it like water coming up into a straw. And it will stabilize around what's called the potentiometric surface. Basically, it's an indication of how much pressure is on that Floridan aquifer in that area. We're going to come back to that potentiometric surface briefly. And again, the real purpose of this slide is really just to illustrate and show that there is a very distinct difference between shallow superficial aquifers that do have a direct connection to surface water bodies and the deeper Floridan aquifer, which is separated by that thick aquitard or confining layer. Now for a little bit of background and really more of a holistic look of groundwater use of the Floridan aquifer across the Southeast. The proposed permits are for 6.6 million gallons per day, which is a lot of water. But when you look at it in regards to the overall groundwater use across Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, it's really a drop in the bucket. The information shown on this slide is from a USGS study done in 2015. It's the most recent look at groundwater use across the states. And what you'll see here is that in Florida, there's about 2.5 trillion gallons of water used a day. In Georgia, that number is about 785 million gallons a day. Again, going back to what I stated earlier, which is the Floridan is one of the most productive aquifers in the world. And so while 6.6 seems like a lot of water, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not. We mentioned earlier that the proposed draft permits from EPD include some short-term mitigation measures. And the big one there is looking at potential withdrawal impacts to local existing wells. What you see here is a simulated drawdown in that potentiometric surface within a 5-mile radius of the proposed wells. And you'll notice that the proposed 4 wells actually generate a sort of combined cone of depression. And so what, again, this exhibit really represents is the change in that potentiometric surface or contours across that potentiometric surface within the areas of the well. This modeling was done by EPD, and it's a pretty conservative look at it. It's basically looking at as if all 4 wells were pumping simultaneously, nonstop at full capacity of those permits. And this is the resultant change. It's a little tough to see, but you'll notice that these contours go from about 16.5, so that would be a 16.5 foot reduction in that potentiometric surface from today, out to about 10 foot at the 5-mile radius. Now, typically EPD considers anything less than 30 foot a non-significant impact. However, because of public concern and comments that came into EPD went ahead and out of really an abundance of caution included a condition in the permit that requires Bullock and Bryan County to potentially mitigate any existing wells that experience an impact, significant impact, due to the proposed wells. Again, we'll touch on that in a few slides. In an effort to try to get a handle on exactly the number of private wells that potentially could be in that area, unfortunately, there are no permit records on exactly how many wells there are and exactly where those wells might be. This was sort of a joint effort done by Bullock and Bryan to get a handle on what potentially could be in the area. And these blue dots basically represent about 1,100 total wells based on GIS tax parcel data and aerial photography looking at potential habitable structures that could be served by a well. So again, there's potentially quite a few wells out there, but the exact number's unknown. Agricultural wells are a different story. These are permitted directly through the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, and so we have very exact and precise information on those proposed wells, or existing wells. And within that 5-mile radius, there's actually 3 existing agricultural wells, and there are 2 additional wells right on the outskirts of the 5-mile radius. And you'll see here, we can get some very detailed information on these wells, and you'll also notice that they are on really the lower end of the anticipated change in static level in the, call it, 10.5 to 9.5 foot range. So what does all this mean? What are we talking about when we say impacts to existing wells and this potential mitigation? So this slide is a kind of graphic representation of existing wells in the area. Again, you'll notice that we've got the land surface at the top, and then below that, you've got this roughly 300-foot confining layer or aquitard that separates the limestone aquifer itself from the surface level. And then you've got this Floridan aquifer, which is really just a water-bearing level down here full of limestone that is, again, under pressure. So when you tap into that aquifer with a well, what ends up happening is that pressure pushes water up into the well casing itself, and that will go up to what we call a static water level, or again, that potentiometric surface, which is represented with this blue line. So when we showed those contours earlier and we talked about the anticipated decline of that surface water in the wells, that's what we're talking about. So for the worst case condition, we're looking at about 19 feet, and that is actually at the proposed wells themselves. You get about 1,000 feet away from those proposed wells, that number decreases quickly to about 16 feet of anticipated static water level change. So again, we're looking at somewhere between a 10 to 19 foot total change in that level in existing wells. I mentioned earlier that EPD really typically doesn't consider this to be an impact until you exceed about 30 feet. And the reason for that is most wells built in this area have pumps set 30 to 50 feet below that water level, or about 95 to 115 feet below ground surface. So, the anticipation is there's not really going to be very many wells that it could be affected by this. However, there is a chance, hence the mitigation and the need to have a plan in place for if a well is affected and how it will be dealt with. So let's talk about that, the mitigation fund itself. So this is essentially money that's been set aside. Right now we've got 4 pledges from the Bryan County Development Authority, the Bryan County Development Authority, the Savannah JDA, and Hyundai Motor Group, who have all pledged $250,000 to give us a grand total of $1 million of initial fund balance. And again, that would be used to offset any cost that would be there for any mitigation itself. Now, this is the fund, and the fund is different than the actual plan and the policy. The plan and the policy is currently being put together right now by Bullock and Bryan County. The hope is by the end of 2024, that mitigation plan will be fully developed and approved by both commissions and in place and ready to go. The draft permits from EPD require this mitigation plan and fund to be established within 6 months of the permits being issued or before any pumping from the wells occur, whichever comes first. Again, the plan is to beat both of those schedules and have this done by the end of the year. The mitigation plan itself is going to cover lots of different things. It's going to cover everything from eligibility criteria to potential mitigation measures. And the most likely measure that will be implemented is going to be just simply lowering the well pumps themselves to get them below any impacted water level. And it should be a relatively easy and straightforward change to any of these existing wells. However, you may have some older wells that may need a larger mitigation measure up to including drilling new wells. The well mitigation plan is also going to look at various things on fiscal management of the fund itself, as well as some public information, things to be put on the 2 counties' websites, forms, contact information, list of current Georgia licensed well drillers that can be reached out to, and these kinds of things. And the basic schedule, again, is to have these things completed before the end of 2024. Last but not least, truthaboutwater.org. This is the home of a ton of information relative to the water supply for the Megasite in North Bryan County, There's an additional resource tab there that you can see that has great links to EPD's website, information on the permits, various reports, and other information that you can have on the Florida Aquifer itself. So definitely encourage folks who are interested to learn more to go to this website.